Good day, class. Let's take a look at the study of the absolute value. What is absolute value? We begin with the number line. If you notice on this basic number line, we begin at 0, and maybe we can consider someone's home. So if we're leaving from point 0, which could be our home, I might travel 6 miles in the forward direction. It's also possible that I could drive 6 miles in the backwards direction, or maybe to the left of my home versus to the right of my home. So when we think of absolute value, we're just thinking of how many steps we travel from point 0, whether it is to the right of that point or to the left of that point. In both cases, we travel, in this particular instance, 6 miles from our home. Therefore, we use a special notation to indicate absolute value in algebra. Take a look at this particular example. The number 3 is encased inside of 2 bars, vertical bars, which indicate we are being asked for the absolute value of 3. That means the absolute value of 3 should be represented by the number of steps from 0. In this case, we've taken 3 steps from 0. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. Furthermore, the absolute value of -4, in other words, how many steps from 0 did we travel even though we traveled in the negative direction, would be 4. The absolute value of -4 is 4. Similarly, the absolute value of -87 would be 87. How many steps did we travel from 0? Although we traveled in the negative direction, the question begs the number of steps we traveled and nothing more. Therefore, the absolute value of -87 is 87. This is not a trick question, the absolute value of 0. The absolute value notation still indicates how far we traveled from 0. In this case, we traveled 0 steps from 0. Therefore, the absolute value of 0 is 0. Let's take a look at negatives in absolute value. Negatives can be considered a different way of expressing opposite. So you'll hear me say opposite quite often. So think carefully when I'm using the term opposite. Let's compare these. If we're asked to find the absolute value of 5, well then we're thinking once again about the distance that we traveled from 0. We traveled 5 steps from 0. We'll take another look at a different version of this example. The absolute value of -5, and we talked about that a moment ago, would be how far we traveled from 0, which is 5 steps from 0. Even though we traveled in the negative direction, we still traveled 5 steps from 0. Furthermore, the opposite of the absolute value of 5 is what we want to think carefully about. Since the absolute value of 5 is 5, then we want our answer to reflect the opposite, which would be -5. Keep in mind that the negative indicates the opposite when it's sitting outside of the absolute value sign. Therefore, the opposite of the absolute value of 5 is -5. Furthermore, the opposite of the absolute value of -5 would also be -5. Since the absolute value of -5, meaning how many steps away from 0 we are, would be 5, then the opposite of that would also be -5. So keep in mind that the opposite of the absolute value of negative 5 is negative 5. Let's take a look at a different example. The absolute value of 20, very carefully, very safely, is just 20. We've traveled 20 steps from 0. The absolute value of negative 20 is also 20. Even though we travel in the negative direction, we've traveled 20 steps from 0. Additionally, the opposite of the absolute value of 20 is negative 20. Since the absolute value of 20 is 20, then the opposite of that would be negative 20. And lastly, the opposite of the absolute value of negative 20 would be negative 20. Since the absolute value of negative 20 is just 20 steps from 0, then the opposite of that would be negative 20.